Hello everybody, welcome to part 3. Now before we go any further, I'm just going to take a second and I'm going to do the code word for today's lecture. So the code word for today's lecture is gold, as in the precious metal, gold. So please make sure you write that down because you're going to need it for the weekly code word quiz, which is going to be hosted on D2L. Okay guys, so let's keep moving. So now we're moving on to deposition. So the first thing we need to think about is, well, why does a sediment get deposited? So if we're thinking about a clastic sediment, the kind of thing that would be transported by a river, it's all down to energy. So as your river is, when your river's up here in the mountainous region, it's dropping quite quickly because the gradient's quite steep, so that means the water's moving quite fast, and so that means your water has quite a bit of energy. Well, that means it can transport a very broad range of class sizes. It can transport really small stuff like clays, and it can transport quite large stuff like gravels and cobbles and maybe even boulders because the water has so much energy. In contrast, as the gradient begins to shallow and become very, very shallow, the velocity of your water begins to slow down. And this means that the energy of your transporting medium is getting lower. This means that your river will now no longer have the capacity to move the large, heavy clasts. So what does it do? It dumps them. It deposits them. And steadily, as your river begins to get weaker and weaker, as the gradient gets shallower and shallower, it will steadily have to deposit the clasts, well, different sizes of clast as it goes. So eventually, by the time your river is very close to the coast, your river will be dominated by clays and silts and typically quite fine sands. So deposition is just in response to energy. So okay, once our sediment is deposited, what's happening? Okay, so our sediment is going to be deposited. In this case, it's being deposited into an ocean in this diagram. And here's our layer right at the top, this cream coloured layer right there. Okay, so our sediment's being deposited and it's forming a nice horizontal sheet like we can see here. And this sheet is made up of the clasts, which we can see in this diagram here. And in between the clasts is going to be lots and lots of water, because remember, we're in an ocean now. So what happens next? Well, over time, another layer is going to build up on top, then another layer, and all of a sudden this layer here is going to find itself getting deeper and deeper in the stack. So what does that mean? Well, that eventually means pressure is going to start increasing. So as pressure begins to increase, we have compaction. Compaction is going to take these clasts, which are separated from one another, and it's going to push them closer together, and all of a sudden all of this space in between them is going to be squeezed out. You can see we're going to end up with a situation like this one here, where we have the clasts all tightly packed around each other with much smaller spaces in between them. So that's compaction. Now then what's going to happen is one of a couple of things. The first thing that can happen to your sediment is it can be cemented. So the process of cementation is simply another mineral gets deposited and that sticks your clasts together, just like cement sticking together bricks in a wall. Another thing that can happen is the process of diagenesis. That's when the minerals in your rock begin to break down and form new minerals. And as those new minerals grow, they'll typically grow into one another. So they'll lock into each other. And this process of locking into each other will produce quite a strong rock. Okay, so compaction, as you probably work out, we've discussed it already. When your sediment is uncompacted, the clasts are very broadly spaced out. They're separated by a lot of empty space, typically filled with water. When the sediment gets compacted, the clasts get forced closer together, and obviously your sediment is now taking up a smaller volume, which is pretty much what you're aiming for. Now, if you do it with particles like sand or cobbles or gravels or even boulders at an extreme level, you end up with something like this, where you have spaces in between your clasts. Now, if you're doing it with particles which are clay-sized particles typically look like this. They're typically, disc-shaped, so the crystals are quite broad, but they're quite thin. So think of a piece of paper. So if you take this randomly jumbled set of crystals here and you begin to put them under pressure, what happens is all of these very thin crystals begin to lie down parallel to each other. And so when you compact a very clay-rich sediment, you'll actually start forming layers in it. And we'll see more of those when we do today's lab. So obviously compaction, loss of pore space. You can see here in this model, in this rather grainy looking image actually, now that I get it up this big, but hey, we're sticking with it. You can see this is our uncompacted sediment. This is our compacted sediment, and then later on you can see we have this brown material here. This is the cement. So this is another mineral that's been deposited later, which is sticking these clasts together. So that's one of the ways in which we can essentially take a loosely consolidated sediment and turn it into a robust rock. So cementation. What happens? Well, obviously we deposit a mineral in the spaces in between the clasts. That mineral is typically calcite, which is calcium carbonate, or silica, which is SiO2. Those are your two most common options. And so these minerals will be deposited in the spaces in between the clasts, and they will essentially stick them together just like cement sticking bricks together in a wall. Nothing particularly complicated about it at all. Why does cementation take place? Well, once again, not the best diagram in the world, but it does kind of show what is happening. Here are our clasts in grey. Now, obviously, during the process of compaction, we are squishing our uncompacted sediment, and so all of that water that's in between our clasts is being squeezed out, just like squeezing a sponge. However, we are actually quite far underground by this point. Temperatures can be quite high, so we could be looking at temperatures ranging above 100 Celsius, and so this means you have a hot water moving around through the loosely compacted sediment underground. And so as that water moves around underground, it starts to what we refer to as scavenge. So it will start to pick up and dissolve other minerals. And so if your hot water starts moving through something like a very limestone rich layer, it might start picking up calcium carbonate. If it moves through a very silica rich layer, it might start picking up silica. And so what happens is as your fluid excuse me, as your fluid is moving through your compacting rock, it will start to redeposit some of those minerals that it earlier scavenged around the clasts as it goes. And so you can see here these blue arrows represent the water moving through in between the clasts, and as it's moving through, it's depositing layer after layer, very, very thin layers of this yellow mineral. And you can see the coating, the cement, it will get thicker and thicker and thicker until the coatings of individual clasts begin to meet up and link together, and eventually, if the cementation goes far enough, it will actually completely fill up the pore spaces here, and you'll have no porosity in your rock whatsoever. So typically, the more cement you have, the stronger your rock will be, for obvious reasons. The more space you have in between your clasts, typically the weaker your rock will be. Okay, so cementation is actually quite a straightforward process, nothing particularly spectacular going on. So what about recrystallization or diagenesis? Well, this is the process by which we take the original minerals and we turn them into a new mineral. So the obvious question is, why does that happen? Well, typically minerals that make up things like shells will be stable at the conditions in which the animal grows. So let's think of an oyster. An oyster is perfectly happy on the seafloor, relatively cool temperatures. The water's going to be 10 Celsius, maybe 5 Celsius. Pressure is going to be relatively low, 1, maybe just over 1 atmosphere's pressure. And so your oyster uses aragonite to make its shell because that's the best mineral for the job under those conditions. Aragonite, by the way, is calcium carbonate. However, when your oyster dies and the shell gets incorporated into the sediment, and that sediment gets buried deeper and deeper and deeper, well, the pressure and temperature is going to start going up. And so as the pressure and temperature starts going up, the aragonite is all of a sudden going to start going, no, I don't like this. The temperature's too high, the pressure's too high, I'm going to have to turn into another mineral, something that's more stable under these conditions. And so in that situation, the aragonite will break down and it will form calcite. Aragonite is calcium carbonate, calcite is calcium carbonate. So the chemical formula doesn't change, it's just, the crystal lattice changes slightly. Now the process itself, if we just step over here for a second, will cause the original crystals, which can often be quite small but numerous, to form far fewer but much larger crystals. And these new crystals, when they grow, will interlock with each other, which will produce a far stronger rock. Now that's a case of diagenesis where we just have a very simple change. In some cases the diagenesis can be a bit more extreme. You can have the aragonite being replaced by something like pyrite, which is fool's gold, iron sulfide. So once again, that means the original aragonite is completely destroyed and it's replaced by the pyrite. Once again, that's another example of diagenesis. In both cases, just changing aragonite to calcite or aragonite to pyrite, in both of those instances you end up forming new crystals, and those new crystals are locked into each other, and so it can produce quite a robust rock. Alright, so we've weathered and eroded our rock, we've transported it as sediment, we've deposited it, and now we've buried it, compacted it and lithified it. Good work us. So what's next? Well, next I'm going to quickly check the time because I can't find it. Also good work me. There it is. Okay. And so now we're going to discuss the types of sedimentary rocks which actually exist. And sedimentary rocks can be split into two very broad groups. There are detrital sedimentary rocks. Now these are the ones which are made of clasts. So these are the ones that consist of pieces of rocks and minerals. And these pieces of rocks and minerals can be igneous in origin, sedimentary in origin, or metamorphic in origin. And these rocks which are broken down to make these clasts are referred to as the parent rock or the source rock. The other type of sedimentary rock we have are chemical or non-clastic sedimentary rocks. And these are rocks that are made up from chemical precipitates, so minerals which form from a dissolved state or seashells made by living aquatic creatures. So you can see there's a distinct difference. These ones are going to be made up of particles, essentially, clasts, and these ones, on the whole, will not be. Okay, so detrital rocks. They make up about 75% of all sedimentary rocks. They're by far and away the dominant variety. And detrital rocks are typically made up of four minerals. Quartz, SiO2, feldspar. Now if you remember, feldspar typically comes in a couple of common varieties, potassium feldspar and plagioclase feldspar. They're both quite robust minerals and typically pretty chemically stable. The micas, the most common two micas are of course biotite and muscovite. They are of course the very thin, flexible, shiny crystals that we've seen earlier in the course. They tend to be a little bit less stable, so they will tend to break down, especially when they're in contact with water. And finally we have clay minerals. So clay minerals are very, very stable and they typically form very, very fine crystals. So those are our four most common minerals. And the next thing we need to think about is particle size, because the size of the clasts is going to define what we call our rock. So typically rocks that contain very, very coarse clasts are going to be classified as a breccia or a conglomerate. Rocks that contain sand size clasts will typically be classified as a sandstone. And rocks that contain clay and silt size clasts will typically be defined as a shale. So depending on the size of the class, that controls what we're going to call our clastic rock. And of course, as we've already touched on, clastic rocks can be formed by the transportation of sediment by water, gravity, wind, or ice. Okay, so once again, just to drive this point home, we've already seen something similar to this, but let's just quickly look at it. We do of course have our class sizes: clay, silt, sand, granule and pebble are referred to by me as gravel, cobble and boulder. So we have clay, silt, sand, gravel, cobble, boulder. And we can see that depending on the size of your sediment, your size of your class, come over here, these are the types of sedimentary rock which are commonly associated with those class sizes. So the class size is all important. So what we need to do is we need to work out how big are the class. That's going to help us work out what we name our rock. Okay, so the first type of rock we're going to talk about is breccia. So breccia is one of the sedimentary rocks that contains quite large clasts, anything larger than 2 millimeters. Okay, these clasts will also be, as you can see in the picture here, angular. So if we have a clastic sedimentary rock that contains angular pieces, you can see the sharp corners here, which are larger than 2 millimeters in size, it's going to be classified as a breccia. So breccias by their nature are often relatively poorly sorted, so there will be a big range in class sizes, and there will typically be a limited amount of rounding, so the class will often be quite angular. And the fact that they are very poorly sorted and the fact that the clasts have not been rounded suggests that the sediment has not been transported very far. Remember, the longer we transport the sediment for, the rounder it will become and the better sorted it will become. So breccias are most commonly associated with relatively short-lived events like landslides. So what can we see here? Well, here we can see two different types of breccia. Now this one I'm afraid isn't a great picture, but what you can see is this grey material here is a breccia with a rocky matrix. This one over here is a breccia with a muddy matrix. So you can see there are differences in the matrix, and the matrix is the material that sits in between the clasts. In terms of environments where we tend to get breccias, well, we tend to get breccias in areas of high topography, where typically we have quite energetic events. Those events can be landslides and flash floods. They're typically relatively short-lived, and so the clasts do not have time to become rounded, better sorted, or become smaller. What about conglomerates? Well, a conglomerate is pretty much the same as a breccia, large clasts in excess of 2 millimeters. But unlike a breccia, those clasts will be rounded. So if we look in the picture over here, in the breccia picture we saw a couple of slides ago, the clasts were very, very angular and sharp. In contrast, these clasts have been smoothed off, giving them a round to sub-rounded appearance. Conglomerates will often display some degree of sorting, and the clasts, as I just mentioned, will be moderate to well-rounded. So the fact that the clasts have become rounded, they've had the sharp corners knocked off, and the fact that the sediment is not relatively well sorted, but has been sorted to some degree, suggests that the sediment must have been transported for a distance. That gives time for the sharp corners to be knocked off the clasts and for the sediment to start to become sorted. So a good example of an environment where we're going to get conglomerates forming are environments like glaciers or fast-flowing river deposits in mountainous areas. Okay, let's look at these conglomerates here. So you can see in both of these instances, the conglomerates have clasts which are sub-rounded, I would say. So this clast here, as you can see, does have a sharpish corner there, so it's not perfectly rounded. But you can also see, some of the clasts like this one here has pretty much had all its sharp corners knocked off. So you have a bit of a range there. So these are, they're both sub-rounded clasts. And so what type of environment do we tend to get these forming in? Well, environments like river channels. These are fast-flowing mountain rivers that have lots of energy. We also have alluvial plains, so these are also associated with these fast-flowing mountain rivers. These are areas where we have sediment being spread out by these mountainous rivers over a broad area. And then we have beaches. Now, most of the time we tend to think of beaches as being sandy, and that's normally the case. So one of the questions is, well, why is a beach sandy? Well, think about it. When we have sediment being deposited at the coast, that sediment is typically going to be a mixture of clay, silt, and sand. So what happens? Well, when the wave hits your clay, silt, and sand mix, the wave goes up the beach, and then the wave comes back down the beach. As the wave comes back down the beach, it picks up the light material. It picks up the clay and the silt. But it's not quite strong enough to remove the sand. So what happens is as the wave goes back into the sea, it pulls the clay and the silt with it, but leaves the sand behind. And so that means you end up with a sandy beach. Now, what happens if your beach is being hit by quite big, powerful waves? Well, in that instance, the clay and the silt are going to be pulled out into the ocean, but so is the sand. And so that means the material that will make up your beach will be far coarser, and you'll have gravels, cobbles making up your beach. You end up with a beach that looks like this. So conglomerates can occur in environments like fast-flowing mountain rivers and beaches which are exposed to big, powerful waves. So how are we going to describe our conglomerate or breccia? Well, first of all, we have to name it. Is it a conglomerate? Is it a breccia? There are a few other terms we can just throw in, which also give us some extra bits of information which are nice to have. The first thing is our matrix or conglomerate classed or matrix supported? So our conglomerate or breccia, what do we have? Well, here's a nice diagram that kind of summarizes the situation. In a matrix supported conglomerate or breccia, the majority of clasts will not be touching. There will be some material, some matrix in between them, separating the clasts. In contrast, in a class supported conglomerate like this one here, most of the clasts will be in direct contact with each other with a little bit of matrix squeezed in between them. We can also look at the degree of sorting of our breccia or conglomerate. So a conglomerate or breccia that shows a relatively tight range of class sizes will be classified as well sorted. A conglomerate that shows a relatively broad range of class sizes can be classified as poorly sorted. And then the final thing we can look at are the clasts themselves. If the clasts come from a range of different rock types, the conglomerate or breccia can be defined as polymicted, or polymictic isn't the other way of describing it. If the clasts all come from the same source, like all the clasts in our conglomerate are made of granite, well, in that case, the rock will be referred to as monomicted or monomictic. So let's have a look at these samples here. So we can see in this particular instance, we definitely have ourselves a breccia. Okay, so these clasts are larger than 2 millimeters, and we can't really miss the sharp points, can we? So it's definitely a breccia. Well, what else can we see though? Well, we can see that all of these clasts all have this kind of pinkish red colour. So the clasts have all come from the same source. This is a monomicted breccia. In terms of sorting, well, how well sorted is it? Well, we can see we have a pretty large clast up here. We have some medium-sized clasts here, and we have some very, very small material here. So this is a pretty poorly sorted breccia. And the final thing is, well, is it matrix or class supported? Well, we can see that the vast majority of clasts are in direct contact with one another. So this is going to be a class supported breccia. So this has angular class, so it's a breccia. One rock type, so it's monomicted. Most of the clasts are touching, so class supported. And there's a range of class sizes, so it's poorly sorted. So it's a poorly sorted monomicted class supported breccia. Now that's obviously a very, very long name. When we do the lab, you would just simply refer to it as a breccia. But I'm just putting these terms in just so you can kind of know how geologists will describe these types of rocks. Okay, what about this sample here? Well, in this case, we can see the clasts are, on the whole, rounded to sub-rounded. This one kind of has a approximately 90-degree corner there, so not perfect, but on the whole, most of these clasts are pretty well rounded, but not quite all of them. So we're looking at a rock where most of the clasts are sub-rounded, but they're definitely in excess of 2 millimeters. So what we're looking at here is a conglomerate. What about the conglomerate? Well, what about the class type? So we can see we have a huge range of different colors. This tells us the rocks are different, and so we have a polymicted conglomerate. What about the class in terms of whether they're touching or spaced out? We can see these clasts are in contact with one another, so once again, this is a class-supported conglomerate. And once again, we have a very, very large range of class sizes, just like the breccia here, so this is quite a poorly sorted conglomerate. So rounded class means it's a conglomerate, Different rock types means it's polymixed. Most clasts are touching, class supported. Range of different class sizes, poorly sorted. So this is a poorly sorted, polymixed, class supported conglomerate. Once again, pretty huge name there. Okay, what about sandstones? Well, sandstones are made up of particles which are in between essentially 1/16 and 2 millimeters in diameter. So that's 0.06 and 2 millimeters in size. Now, the very, very fine sands you will not be able to see easily, even with a magnifying glass. However, you can feel them. So if you've ever been to a hardware store, Home Depot, Lowe's, something like that, and you've ever touched a piece of sandpaper, you know how it feels. You know it feels abrasive, but you can also feel it has individual little particles in there. That's the same kind of feeling that you will get from a sandstone. And so if you ever come up to a piece of rock and you run your finger over it, and it feels rough and abrasive like a piece of sandpaper, your mind should instantly start thinking sandstone. Now, the other nice thing is this: your sense of touch is sensitive enough to help you work out what size of sand you're dealing with, because sand comes in 3 varieties: fine sand, medium sand, and coarse sand. So as you touch your sandstone, if the particles in your sandstone feel coarse, well, guess what? It's a coarse sand. If your finger kind of glides across the rock and the particles kind of slightly abrasive on your fingertips, well, it's a fine sand. If it's somewhere in between, it's a medium sand. So your sense of touch is really going to help you when you are essentially classifying the size of sand class within your sandstone. So the predominant mineral within sandstones is usually quartz, but your sandstone can also contain varying amounts of feldspar, and it can also contain varying amounts of clay and silt. Now, this is important because it's going to essentially change the name of our sandstone. So if our sandstone is very, very quartz rich, we're going to call it simply a quartz sandstone. If, however, our sandstone is a mixture of quartz and feldspar, we're going to refer to it as an Arkose sandstone. If our sandstone is a mixture of particles, class made up of, let's say, quartz and feldspar, and quite a lot of clay and silt, we would refer to that sandstone as a graywacke. So sandstones are formed in a range of different varieties: beaches, dunes, rivers. Sand occurs in a whole load of environments, so sandstones are very, very common. So we need to look for other smaller indicators to work out what type of environment the sandstone was deposited in. Now, we're not going to discuss that today. That's something we'll be discussing in the next lecture. So just to give you some idea, here we go. Here's a close-up of a sandstone, and you can see this is 1 centimeter, so 1/10 of this bar here would be a single millimeter. So we can see that most of these clasts here are going to be in the size range of about 0.5 millimeter maximum. And this is what a sandstone looks like down the microscope. So we can see here we have the quartz. That's this kind of grey to black looking mineral. And in this case, the quartz is cemented by calcite, and you can see that as this kind of very neon pink, green, and orange looking mineral. So that's the calcite which is cementing these quartz grains together. Okay, so when we look at sandstones, what do we see? Well, some sandstones will be massive. That means they will show no layering at all. But it's not uncommon for sandstones to contain layers, both at a close level and at a coarser level. In terms of, as we've discussed, where sands form, they are very, very common. It's a very, very common sediment size. So it can occur in environments ranging from sand dunes to rivers to beaches to shelf environments offshore, to mention but a few. So what about our different type of sedimentary, or sandstone should I say? Well, here are 2 subgroups. Remember, a quartz sandstone is a sandstone that's very, very rich in quartz. Another type of sandstone that will cross our path on a regular basis is the Arkose sandstone. Now, Arkose sandstone, as you can see from this picture, is relatively medium to coarse grained. So the class size is going to be quite large. It's going to contain typically less than 75% quartz and feldspar. So it's going to be a mixture of quartz, feldspar and rock fragments. You can see a few of the rock fragments right here. The rock itself will typically have a red colour. And that's because it contains feldspars, so potassium feldspar can in some instances be pink. And there will typically be iron oxides in the rock. The presence of iron oxides typically suggests that your rock has formed in dry or semi-arid conditions. So it's not a perfect rule, but a rule of thumb will typically suggest that if you see a red rock like this, it's typically formed in a desert or semi-desert environment. The clasts themselves in Arkose sandstone will typically be angular to moderately rounded, which suggests that they have not been transported that far. Which suggests that the sediment itself was deposited close or moderately close to the source rock. Now, once again, we're going to discuss Arkoses in greater detail when we're doing the next lecture. Greywackes. Well, greywackes, as you can see here, are grey in colour in most cases. They are a mixture of sand and muds, and so that obviously explains the grey colour. Clays and silts will typically be grey, and so that obviously gives the rock that appearance. They will often be very poorly sorted. You'll have a range of clay, silt, sand, and the sand can be in varying sizes, fine, medium and coarse. The majority of greywackes are formed by submarine landslides, so underwater. So they're often a marine rock, quite deep marine in fact. They are also often extremely deformed, fractured and veined. And because of their appearance being quite dark in colour and relatively fine-grained, it's not uncommon for them to be mistaken for basalt. So you have to know what you're looking for, or look at the rock down a microscope, and that will tell you exactly whether you've got a greywacke or a basalt. In terms of the fine-grained clastic rocks, well, we have siltstones, which are dominated by silts. We have mudstones, which are dominated by silts and clays. And we have shales, which are dominated by clays. So the amount of silt and clay will affect which type of rock you essentially classify your rock as. Now, in terms of muddy rocks, well, they tend to form in only the lowest energy environment. That's because it's actually quite difficult to get clay and silt sized particles to settle out. So if you think about it, if you think of most rivers that you've been to, what you'll notice is the water tends to be quite murky. And that's because there's lots and lots of silt and clay sized particles suspended in that water, giving it that murky appearance. So in order to get those clay and silt sized particles to drop out, your water needs to come to a near complete stop because the particles are so small and light. So that means if you're going to essentially deposit these types of sediment, you need to essentially stop whatever's doing the transporting. And so a good mechanism for doing that kind of thing is the wind. The wind blows, the wind stops blowing, they get deposited. Floodplains. Your river floods. As the water comes out of the river, it's full of suspended clay and silt in the water, but as the water leaves the river, it starts to lose velocity, it slows down, comes to a complete stop, and then once it's come to a complete stop, it will start depositing the clay and silt. Lake environments. If your river goes into a lake, all of a sudden your fast-flowing river hits a lake, and essentially it's like driving your car into a wall. Your river hits the immovable water of the lake, the river loses velocity very, very quickly, the water comes to a near complete stop, and the clays and silts start being deposited. The same thing goes for the ocean. Once again, your river, bang, hits an ocean or sea, and in that case you're going to get sediment being deposited. You're going to end up with things like deltas. So very, very fine silt and clay rich rocks can only form in very, very low energy environments. They're also quite helpful to us because they can often contain certain certain things that will help us to work out what type of environment they were deposited in. So it's not uncommon for shale fossils, for shales to contain fossils, things like plants, freshwater fish, crustaceans, a whole range of animals, bees, insects, a whole range of organisms can get caught essentially in the sediment and be incorporated into it and fossilized. So that's obviously extremely helpful to us, because if we start finding freshwater fish in our mudstone, well, that would suggest we may be dealing with a lake sediment. If we start finding pieces of plant like this, well, that might suggest we're dealing with some kind of maybe swampy lagoonal environment maybe. So the fossils that we find within our mudstones are extremely helpful, because once again, mud, silt and clay is extremely common. So that makes it very difficult to work out exactly what kind of environment our silt and clay was being deposited into. What really helps us are fossils. So it helps us to work out what type of environment the muds were being dropped into. Another thing we can look for are mud cracks. So mud cracks happen when your mud dries out. And obviously if your mud's drying out, well, that means it must be in contact with the atmosphere. So that means your mud must have been deposited by a flood, or maybe it's a muddy sediment deposited along the edges of a lake, for instance, where it's going to get exposed to the atmosphere, dry out and crack. So the presence of mud cracks gives us quite a good indicator that, number one, we are probably on land, and number two, we have to think of some kind of environment in which we can have muddy sediments being deposited, but at the same time, those muddy sediments must be allowed to dry out and crack. Okay, so we're going to stop here for now. So if you want to go and get yourself a glass of water, a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, and come back for part 4, I'll see you in a few minutes.